Hello, and thank you for watching this presentation by the American Iris Society. Please support the organization by becoming a member. Go to irises.org and click on Join. Thank you.
This is a photo of Jean in her commercial gardens that I discovered in the pile of papers from the family home. And it's really essentially what Jean was all about. As we know, she was the queen of irises in a lot of ways. So I'm going to talk across a range of things today. You'll see that the story goes in a lot of different directions, and I'm going to touch on a lot of things that actually have a lot more behind them. So yeah, you'll understand as I go on. So first of all, just a little bit about me to give you a bit of context. So my background is in engineering, but I've been writing for a long time now, often about technical stuff. And I guess that's one of the reasons that the Jean story interests me, among other reasons, is because of the technical work that Jean was doing with the hybridizing, the pushing the boundaries and things. So I've written about engineering heritage over the years, but I'm focused more and more on this Blooming Impossible biography of Jean. And just a note at the bottom, there's no short word for it, but I'm related to Jean through her daughter, who was my aunt, Jocelyn Bell. And first of all, a thank you. Gary mentioned earlier, I couldn't have got to this point with the project and given it so much more depth without the support of the Ministry of Culture and Heritage, who gave me a grant to help with my research trip, the American Iris Society Foundation, and the Bason Botanic Gardens here in Whanganui. So lots of other support, but those are kind of key and critical to making what's happened so far happen. So yeah, big thank you. So this is kind of an overview slide, and then we get into a bit more detail of the story. So this gives you a bit of context and scene setting. Jean was a pioneering, by the way, this photograph, you were talking about photos before, this was taken while Jean was in the States in 1956. And, you've got that lovely tinted kind of colouring to the image, but the hats and the fashion and things, it's very quintessentially 50s America. So yeah, this is her time in America. She was a pioneering iris and leucadendron hybridizer. So she was very much known for her irises, but she did more than just irises. She was also, the first female guest speaker to be invited to speak at an AIS convention, which was in Los Angeles in 1956. She was the third speaker to come from outside the US and the first to come from the Southern Hemisphere. There's just some key notable achievements here. Destiny was Jean's first iris success, and it won a British Iris Society bronze medal in 1934. And then, of course, we've got Pinnacle, which was the first yellow amoena, and TB Sunset Snows, which was the first pink amoena and is still gorgeous, even by today's standards. And then just a selection of the awards that she's won over the years to give you a bit of an idea of what she achieved. The bottom one is the Royal Horticultural Institute of New Zealand, and the 3 awards in Florence were, once again, firsts for various reasons. We'll get to that. So you get a bit of a sense of this kind of big personality in the iris world, and just a taste of what she achieved. So Jean, the map, I understand you can see my pointer, so hopefully you can see my pointer. This is a map of New Zealand, North Island. So this middle star on the left is near where I am at the moment in Whanganui. Jean was born at Stratford, which is maybe an hour north of here, so that middle star, in 1900. And she's always been known as Jean, even though Emily is officially her first name. She went to Gisborne on the right of the map with her family and finished her secondary schooling in Gisborne. She had 2 older siblings, a brother and a sister. And then when she moved to Auckland, she won a scholarship to go to secondary school in Auckland, which is the top star but she didn't complete her first year because her youngest sister was born and she was needed at home. And so she left school, didn't finish her first year of secondary schooling, and the family moved to Whanganui, which is the bottom star, which is near Wellington, which is the New Zealand capital. Um, I'm not quite sure why they moved to Whanganui. I suspect there was family connections, and also because Jean's father was in the horticultural business, and it is the breadbasket for the Wellington provisions even today. So there's good fertile areas in Whanganui area that the family settled on. And so this is a picture of the family nurseries, farms in the 20s. If you zoom in, you can see these lovely ladies are wearing cloche hats and 20s garb, which is very cool. Wellington would have been to the right of the image. Those are the hills down the spine of New Zealand, North Island behind. And these would have been Jean's irises, because Jean's father ran the nursery business, and he imported among the first of the irises to come into New Zealand in 1921. And then in 1923, he gave Jean sole responsibility for the iris part of the family business. So she took over sales, but also began to do the propagation work. So she was 23 at that point. But obviously, when you look at what I said earlier, you understand that the father was helping the daughter to get some kind of economic foothold because she hadn't been able to finish schooling. And she was a bright little girl. So she would have been interested. Somebody was telling me she was interested even before she took this over. Yeah, so she had this pedigree in the nursery world even before she stepped into the iris space. As I said before, this is Destiny, which is quite a traditional colouring with the purples and the dark and the light. But you guys will know more than me. This is very much a step up from the ordinary irises that are similar to it in colouring. So Jean was obviously propagating very early from taking over the irises, and she sent her first crosses to Britain in 1928 for assessment, and she corresponded with people in Britain who were supporting her as mentors, as well as just explaining how to work the ropes to get through this process. And then her first cultivar was released, which was Destiny, in 1934. And then it won a British Iris Society bronze medal. So it was the first in the Southern Hemisphere to do so. It was just the beginning for Jean, but obviously you can see the potential that Jean was bringing to the iris world because she was already demonstrating a strong sense of understanding breeding and how to look at an iris and gather a sense of whether it's good or not, and also the breeding potential of the plants that she was working with. So you can see even at this very early stage that she had a lot of that well in hand. So this is Wally Stevens. This is Jean's husband. Jean met Wally at a flower show, which is just lovely, in 1935, and then they married the following year in Otaki, which is near Whanganui, Jean's home, and they settled in Bulls, which is a small community about half an hour's drive from Whanganui, which is where Jean ended up with Wally when they. In the next slide, I'll get onto that. And then, so they settled in Bulls and had Jocelyn, which is my aunt, and that was their only child. And Jean moved into the Stevens Brothers business, and the first bearded irises catalogue was issued. So to back up the bus a little bit, Wally, his father was a butcher, and most of his brothers went into the butchery trade. Wally was interested in plants, and he did an apprenticeship with Duncan and Davies, which was an important nursery in New Zealand, horticultural business. And he and his brother Frank set up Stevens Brothers sometime in the 30s, I think. And Wally was quite an intrepid young man. as interested in botanical stuff as Jean, so they were a really good match. And when Jean came into the business and married Wally, the Stevens brothers' name was retained, even though Jean stepped in and Frank stepped aside. It just stayed like that. And even after Jean and Wally passed and my uncle and aunt took over the business, the Stevens brothers' name continued on. And so the couple and Jocelyn, the family, had been in Bulls. The it's a little bit, it's near the coast, but a little bit inland on a river flat. The climate is not so benign as it is here in Whanganui, and for that reason, primarily, the couple moved to Whanganui in the mid-40s. This is their property around about the time they'd just settled in. The lovely building at the back, the lovely tower, that's the water tower in on Bastia Hill, which still works to this day. It's designed to look a bit Roman with its arches and things. It provides water for the suburb of Bastia Hill and a neighbouring hill adjacent. So it's always kind of in the background of a lot of the pictures. But you get the real sense that this was a farmhouse on a huge, essentially a paddock with not much on it when the couple bought the property. It's now 5 minutes from town, but in these days it was the country. And you can see the driveway goes left up to the house where the hedge is there. There's not a lot of plants apart from tiny ones that the couple is establishing, and Jean's iris is at the front, below which is the road. So the property kind of goes up to the house and then around beyond the house and over the other side of the hill. There was about 11 hectares at the time when they first started settling in. And so we move on from what I was talking about, Destiny before. Pinnacle was Jean's, it is very well named. It was her big milestone celebrated achievement. Jean loved yellow irises, yellow, the colour and the colour combination of yellow and white. And so that was her first challenge. But she also liked the challenge of producing a colour combination that people didn't think was possible. So before Jean developed Pinnacle, the word amoena referred to a purple and white kind of combination because, and so when Jean, when Pinnacle came along, for a long time they were calling it, like I've said in my title, the yellow amoena, because amenas were specifically the purpley colours and yellows weren't even thought to be possible. So it wasn't just that they didn't exist, it wasn't thought to be possible. So Barry, who's on the call, he can tell you a lot more than I can. But a lot of this is to do with working with recessives and breeding beyond the. If you can breed with recessives, you get all sorts of interesting colour combinations that come out that are unexpected. And Jean was adept in this space, which is why she managed to achieve some of the breakthrough colour combinations that hadn't really been achieved before. So what I've got up here is Pinnacle, Summit, and Mystic Melody. You can see that Pinnacle was the first, so it's highly celebrated, but actually Summit is technically superior, and then Mystic Melody, which is the other seed sister of Summit. They're all slightly different from one another, but in the same development space. And so here I've picked up some quotes from things Jean's written. So with Pinnacle, she was very pleased with the result. Fresh, cool, flawless, totally unique. It is not the white and gold of our original ambition that we have called Summit. So she, even though she could see that Pinnacle was fabulous, it wasn't what she was aiming for quite. And so she kept breeding, developed Sunset. But then when she saw Mystic Melody, if we were given the choice of one iris and only one for our garden, this lovely iris would be our selection. And then with Summit and Mystic Melody, she said, if you're a breeder, buy Summit. If you're a fancier, buy Mystic Melody. So Jean loved Mystic Melody, even though technically Summit is perhaps superior. So as you will all know, I'm sure, there is the technical side and the emotional side with things like irises. And so Jean was not immune to that by any stretch. So these are all irises that I have. Actually, that's not my photo of Summit, but the Mystic Melody and Pinnacle are my photos, and Summit I have just managed to track down as well. So these are irises which luckily we've still got in New Zealand. It's very interesting to compare them side by side because they all have their own beauty and qualities, and they are actually different from each other, perhaps more than you might initially think. And so, to get back to the story of Jean and her work, from these early stories I've been talking about, Jean went on and developed a whole range of irises, as you will be aware. I have to apologise for the top right photograph, which is Foaming Seas. It is actually a very pale blue, but it is a devil of a thing to photograph as pale blue as you see it. So it comes up looking pale purple, but it's actually pale blue. Work in progress to get a photograph that looks right. Um, and in addition, we have Polynesia at the bottom right and Cool Valley, which has got this huge fall. It's just gorgeous and quite prolific, I'm pleased to say. Magnolia, which is scented Black Bell and the Foaming Seas. So this is just a selection, but you get the sense that Jean was now hitting her stride with the iris developments. And she wasn't just working in one space, right? So she was working across a whole range of colours and areas, even though she had particular interests in things that she was breeding towards, e.g., sunset snows. Um, this is just a gorgeous. It's got a different habitat, a different habit from the other irises a bit. It's a bit shorter in the garden, and initially you'd think perhaps it's not going to be such a fabulous iris, but it's beautiful. It's absolutely beautiful. Um, and it was yet another one of Jean's standout achievements in terms of being a colour break. First pink amoena, even though it's kind of a salmony coppery colour and it has a bit of a shimmer to the falls as well, but absolutely standout achievement. It won 3 awards in Florence, as I said before, the first Southern Hemisphere breeder to win, the first iris to win 3 awards of any iris from anywhere. So yeah, just absolutely fabulous achievement. And this was towards the end of life. It was one of her finest achievements, I guess you could say. And a nod to you, Barry. So Barry knows an awful lot about this iris in particular because it has a lot of recessive sitting in the background of its genetic makeup, and of the 1,500 odd irises that Barry's introduced, he has calculated that half have this iris in their parentage. And what's even more amazing to people like me who are botanical novices, you look at the diversity of the irises that Barry has produced with this in the background, and they've got different colours, they've got different sort of levels of frills. Because of the recessive in the genetic makeup, you get all these interesting throwbacks. You don't get what you would predict to get from the breeding work, which is what makes it interesting, I would say, having tapped Barry's brain and got a little bit of a sense of it. So that's a bit of a sense of the iris side of Jean's life. She was also very much an avid correspondent. Of course, this was the day of writing, but of the material I've managed to save from the home, I've got folders of correspondence. She wrote to everybody about everything, and she was hugely articulate and interested. And she also wrote lots of articles. This particular book she wrote and published in Australia in 1952. It's got some photographs, black and white photographs, because period in it. But and if you sense of her voice, but it is also a nod to Jean that it's designed for the ordinary gardener to read and understand and get interested in irises. So she was quite capable of top academic kind of level with botanical work, but she was very much trying to engage with ordinary gardeners, particularly with this work. So yeah, that's still around the traps, and it's still very readable and useful today. And this is quite relevant to the audience. So in 1956, Jean was invited as a guest speaker to the AIS convention in Los Angeles. And it being those days, it was a multi-leg journey just to get to the US. So I think they went from Auckland, New Zealand, to Fiji, to Honolulu, to LA. And then while she was in the US, the AIS people said, well, you've got to come and see all of the gardens we have. And so she and Wally, this is the picture at the bottom of them about to depart on their journey. They did this huge marathon trip across the States and stayed with a lot of AIS members and visited gardens. And, you know, you've got to remember by this stage, Jean's in her late 50s, about a decade before she's died, and she's getting to the point where she's not able to travel. So huge journey. Wally had quite the sense of humor. He says he just went along to carry the bags essentially, but you know, that's not true. He had his own interests and connections, but he was very proud of Jean and her achievements that got them on this trip in the first place. And so next phase of the story, Jean and Wally were about a lot more than what I call just irises. So these are photographs of some of the plants that we found in the Stevens Bell garden. So Jean and Wally's garden that became Ian and Jocelyn's garden. We spent a year going around the garden because, of course, things flower at different seasons. We were finding new things right up until the end. There was just such a wonderland of and Wally and Jean were interested in everything botanical. So particularly from Australia and South Africa, New Zealand, but from everywhere. And so it was just a wonderland if you're interested in plants. And there were, I get to this, but the bearded irises weren't really still at the garden in 2021, which is when we were doing this work. But there were these naturalised dwarf reticulatas just alongside the drive there, which came up in season, and you know, they're just lovely. And so the story keeps going down these rabbit holes, as I warned you. Jean was also interested in leucadendrons, which come from South Africa. And the reason, so the backstory to this, the couple started out in Bulls as a nursery business, and then they moved into the cut flower business. And so when my uncle and aunt took over the business, they were still selling cut flowers to the markets and growing plants and propagating plants for cut flower work. And so the interest in leucadendrons in particular came from a business savvy sense that there was a gap in the market around winter flowers for the floristry industry. And so the South African plants were able to fill that gap because they just look gorgeous in the winter, the proteas and the leucadendrons. Jean made the first known crosses of Leucadendron laureolum and Leucadendron salignum. Now, again, this is something I'm very much still at the beginning of understanding, but it was akin to what she was doing in the iris space. It was interesting, challenging, hybridizing work. It wasn't straightforward, and in addition to the complexity of the work, it was also about Jean recognizing the potential in the different plants and breeding for certain things. So this is getting towards the end of her life. So she managed to develop Red Gem, which is the one bottom left. It's shorter. It's the beginnings of that beautiful red colour. And then so Ian Bell, that's my uncle, worked with her guidance to develop Safari Sunset, which is it's still the most sold cut flower stem globally today. I think I worked out a few years ago it was about 40 million stems of this is sold each year globally for the cut flower market. The reason it is so outstanding is because it has the huge long stem. It has this outstanding claret red colour, and it keeps and keeps and keeps in the vase. So its vase life is exceptional. So yeah, Jean was this amazing iris hybridizer, but there's a lot more to her story than that. And after her life as well, through what she achieved in guiding Ian to develop this standout iris as well. So well worth celebrating Jean's achievements. And so to get a sense of leucadendrons and what they're all about, which, like I say, I'm only just starting to understand, these are just a few of the leucadendrons that were still in the garden when we were looking at it in 2021. You can see there's a diversity of colour, there's a diversity of form, and the colours changed. So this gorgeous pink red in the centre there, it would be a different colour entirely at another time of year. So I was trying to propagate these to save them, and you'd go around the bush and you would never quite be certain whether it was one big plant or several plants in a clump. And what else was I going to say? We also don't know, so I'll get to this in the story a little bit further on, but while I've got the slide up, I'll mention it. We also never totally understood whether these were named varieties or unnamed varieties that were part of the pathway to developing the irises that were named, the leucadendrons that were named at the end. So I'll explain it a bit more detail in a moment, but we went around the garden and we're trying to save the garden, the plants and things. The leucadendrons were kind of the hardest and the most unresolved bit because we just didn't quite know what we were looking at. But you can see, even regardless, they're just gorgeous. And so, as I said, Jean died in 1967. So what I was saying about the leucadendron achievements, that was around the same time, just towards the end of Jean's life. The iris part of the business was wound up, and Ian and Jocelyn Bell continued with Stephen Brothers' business. So Wally died in 1974, and Ian and Jocelyn came into the business and on with the work of running the cut flower business and looking after the gardens, not looking after the iris part of the business because that was sold. And so you can see, compared to, 80 years, it's quite a period of time. And as Gary was saying, we have quite the ideal conditions for growing things in New Zealand. This is some photos of the property in 2021. You can see how much it has evolved as a garden from the early photo that I shared, with essentially a paddock with a few plants on the surface of it. It was very much a semi-jungle. So at this point, my aunt had been dead for a few years and my uncle was less able to manage the garden, so things had gotten away a bit. But yeah, it was also a wonderland to wander through, for all that it was overgrown by this point. And so now we get to the next part of the story. My involvement with the story really began when I was a child. So this photograph was at my grandmother's house, and I spent a lot of time as a child at my grandmother's house. The circle is Jean, and to the left of Jean, behind the lady in the middle, is Wally, typical, in the background, and Ian and Jocelyn on the left there. So I was always very curious about this photograph and the story behind it, because this is Jean and Wally's and my uncle and aunt's garden. The lady in the middle was Queen Mother in Britain, so she's the grandmother of the current King Charles of Britain, and she had a royal tour to New Zealand in 1966, and she had a free afternoon, as I understand it, and the family had half an hour to get ready, and my cousins had to quickly get changed and learn how to bow, and she popped up to the garden to visit specifically because of Jean's irises. The lady on the right, by the way, is the lady in waiting. So they came up in a flash car and visited, and Jean and the Queen Mum wandered off into the garden and talked irises and other things. And the visit extended beyond the short period that had been allotted. They had a fabulous time, apparently. But this was all very mysterious to me when I was a girl. I didn't really know anything about the story, and the family weren't very open about talking about it. This was after Jean had died, so it was always a curiosity in the back of my mind, and that was where I guess my interest began. If you're told you don't need to know about it, you want to know about it. And the other thing I haven't mentioned is I grew up just down the road from the garden. So I was always going past, going, visiting, looking after the cats for my aunt, so it was always part of my life, although I didn't really understand it. So my uncle died in 2021 after COVID, and even though wasn't aware of the story, I was aware of the importance of the story and the importance of the garden. And so I began, actually before my uncle died, I began talking to him, and he started to be interested in talking about the story, which is wonderful. After he died, I stepped in to try and save the story, the papers, and then I began to be aware of how much there was in the garden. So in the center of the picture here, this is Colin Ogle, who's also here on the right-hand side, and his wife, Robin. And Colin and Robin were good friends of Ian and Jocelyn. So I got to know Colin. He's also a retired botanist. And so we began to, first of all, there were lots of pots full of South African bulbs and things, and we gathered those. Then we began to take an interest in the garden. And so over the course of a year, we would go and visit. Luckily, we had COVID. So the garden, everything was delayed, and we were able to have a bit more time to go to the garden, explore, see what was there, save what we could, and at least make notes about what was in the garden and photographs and things. And the group and the story and the interest grew. So this was a tight group of us who essentially developed into trying to save the garden, which grew from my initial interest in trying to save the story. So this is Sandra Morris, who's a botanical artist. So she actually went up to the garden and spent time there doing botanical art, which in time became an exhibition. Terry Dowdswell down the bottom here, he's a hybridizer of delphiniums, and he took the lead in trying to get some funding and tangible support. Alethea Jones is half Greek, half British, married to a local guy, landscaper. Joe Buckingham lived next door to the gardens, and Robin Kewell down here, he's a filmmaker, so he's been filming the story throughout, and he was heavily involved with the development of the Eden Project with Sir Tim Smith in the UK, among other things. So we had this wonderful group that just grew, and we just went as all guns blazing to try and save what we could and grow an interest in the story and the opportunities that it represented. And this is just a sense of some of what we were doing. So I went on national radio to talk about Jean and saving the garden. Colin tapped his network and got some herbarium people to visit. They spent 2 days collecting specimens at the garden. And we had all sorts of websites, Give a Little. We had a film evening. As I said, we had an art exhibition. So we were getting this amazing traction to try and save Jean's garden and to highlight the story. Little side bit to the story here. So this is Leon Perry. He's in charge of the herbarium at Te Papa, which is the museum in Wellington, in the capital city. And so a group of 3 of them came up and spent the weekend collecting. and then I went back to see what they had done with the material they'd gathered. So there's a link here. You can go and find out a bit. They wrote a story about it on their blog, and you can go into the collection online as well and see the materials yourself. You get a sense of the importance and the interest in the garden because of what they did, spending 2 days collecting plants. There's got to be a bit there to collect. And Leon has subsequently said to me, it's changed the herbarium's thinking a little bit about what they take an interest in collecting, because often it'll be rare, endangered, native species. This is really the first time they've collected from a heritage nursery garden before. So it just changed their thinking a bit. Like I was saying before we started the presentation, in New Zealand, a lot of plants have been brought in to New Zealand and then have gone rogue. They've turned into weeds, or they've become rare, endangered in their homeland. So there's all these different aspects to the story, and what they gathered from the Stevens Bell Garden for the collection, while it's not real plants, it's specimens, it's a whole nother chunk of information, and are giving it forward, if you like. So there's a lot of future work that will come from what we did in this space. Sadly, Jean's garden was eventually sold. So the bottom line really, and why I'm so passionate about sharing the story, is because we had a very tight time frame, but the overarching issue was that essentially people had forgotten about Jean, Wally, Ian, their work, their achievements, their stories. So not only were we trying to say, look, come and support us, we were having to start from the point of saying, okay, so Jean was this important iris hybridizer, and like going right back to the beginning of telling their stories before we could say, and so it's important, and can you help us? And we just didn't have time to do all that. So I'd very much advocate for share the stories that are important, because it helps enormously when it comes to trying to save things further down the line if need be. So Jean's garden was sold. Our focus turned to creating a garden in her honour at the Bason Botanic Gardens. So this is near Whanganui. A farmer and his wife donated the land in the 80s, I think it was, and it's being developed as a heritage / botanical / park garden. This photograph here shows the garden. So it was an iris garden. They took all the irises out and had a giveaway, refreshed the soil, and gave it to us to use. And so simultaneously with that, I went and gathered as many of Jean's irises as I could and put them into my garden. So this is at the bottom of my property. And this is Terry on the left here, who's the Delphinium, I'm having trouble with that word, Delphinium hybridizer. And interestingly, these three people here are relatives of Bob Brown, who was the last gardener who worked for Ian and Jocelyn Bell and for Jean and Wally prior to that. So I used to see him coming up past my place as a girl, with his big black bike, pushing it up to the gardens where Jean and Wally had lived. And he was a gardener right until late in life. So this is a lovely connection, bringing them in. This was us gathered to lift the irises, and they all had to be trimmed and named and everything, and then we took them up to the basin. So this is just a selection of the irises. Again, foaming seas, sorry, it should be pale blue. The bottom ones, Whanganui Gem and Forest Glade, they're just tiny miniature ones. The others are full size. And this is just a selection of what we had that we gathered to take up to the Basin Gardens. And so this is Robin doing his thing with his ongoing documenting of our project. You can see I had a car boot full, and this is us planting them at the basin year before. In the middle here, these have just been left in the meantime. The plan is to replace them with moraias from the Bell Stevens Garden in due course. So that's part of what's happening again this autumn, is to replace that. This says after, it's actually work in progress after. So this was how it looked in the spring we've just had. We've got this signage that's gone up and these beautiful irises. They were just gorgeous. But it's a work in progress because we've subsequently managed to find more of Jean's irises, which is fabulous, but it's a problem because we've got to put them somewhere. A couple of these beds were doubled up because of the space we had. So 2 of those will be removed and replaced, one with Pinnacle and one with another. And on this far side, what we've done is a storytelling approach. We have to figure out how to handle it longer term because it might end up being where Jean's other irises go. We haven't worked that out yet. So on this far side, we've put sunset snows on either end, and we've put a selection of Barry Blythe's irises that have sunset snows in the parentage in the middle. So we're trying to start to tell the story of the science behind what they're looking at as much as looking at the beauty of the irises. So the gardens are trying to get a bit of an educational aspect to the story, as well as a celebration of the local person and just of the beauty of what people see. Okay, next part of the story. So as part of my ongoing challenge of writing the story about Jean and her work, I was very lucky. I got a grant from the Ministry of Culture and Heritage to support a research trip, which I undertook last year. As you can see, it was a whiz-bang round the world trip. But you can also see from this image how much Jean's influence has spread and interest in her work has spread. And what's not shown on here is there's also a link to South Africa, among other places. So, and into more across America as well, not just with irises, but with other plants that the couple were interested in. So this is the project that keeps giving, and I have to keep pulling it back because it can go in so many different directions. It's wonderful and terrible all at the same time sometimes. And so for my research trip, my first stop was to see Barry, and this is his scaled back version for retirement, I'm told. His wonderful garden in Melbourne, and a bit of a sense this is part of a bigger image which Barry has worked on, understanding the genetic links between the various irises, sunset snows and others, to start to get a handle on what he's achieved and where the pathways lie with the genetics and things. And this image at the top here, Barry showed me Lovely Livy, which Thomas Johnson has just recently released out of the States. And the story with that is that it's the ongoing work with sunset snows. So this amazing iris in its own right has this amazing heritage as a parent plant, and it continues forward even now. And in Lovely Livy, you can see the connection visually between that and sunset snows, but you can also see how things have shifted with, you know, the frills and different things as well. So it's quite fascinating, really. I was fortunate. I went to Florence. Jean actually never got to Florence, sadly. She was invited to speak, but she was unwell at the time and unable to travel. But I spoke, as I'm speaking to you, I spoke about the project and the work we've been doing. And the lovely people down the bottom here, Maria Carla and Sophia. Sophia translated me into Italian, which was wonderful. And they just welcomed me and welcomed hearing about the story of Jean and her connection with Florence. And there was a lovely connection. One of the ladies in the audience her mother had been corresponding with Jean back in the day regarding sunset snows and potentially coming to talk at the Iris Gardens and so on. So just starting to scratch the surface of this part of Jean's story, which all on its own, it's another one of those things that could grow as big as you wanted it to. But really interesting place if you ever get to visit, and a lovely connection to Jean's story as well. In the UK, I managed to get to Wisley, which is where the iris trial bed. So I was talking about Destiny before. Jean's irises in those days got sent to Wisley and they were trialled. Iris trials don't happen here anymore, but I talked to the trials manager to understand what it had been like back in the day when Jean was doing her work. So that was really interesting. And there is actually more to tap into in this space because there's archives as well, which I have to get into in more detail. But a lot of this is beginning to get a sense of Jean's story and understanding which bits of the story to focus on, because I can't do it all. And then, of course, I was lucky to get to Oregon. Thomas Johnson was so generous with his time, explaining what he was doing, continuing the Sunset Snows work, and explaining about irises, and just being able to see what he was doing. And Keith, talking to him about Jean's work. And the loveliest thing about visiting Keith was he brought out and showed me some of Jean's hybridizing notebooks. So that brought a little bit of emotion to the moment. It's a difficult project because there's so much about the story I still don't know. So I'm going with a curiosity, but I don't know what I don't know and what I'm looking for. So with going to talk to people like Keith, an element of it is tell me what I need to know. So there is these wonderful moments where things turn up on the table that I didn't even know were part of the story. And this is going to go on and on. At Shriners, I was able to, they were very generous with giving me access to their archives, so I was able to get a whole lot of material. The thing with Shriners' story is it connects with Jean's specific. They were Jean's distributors and agents and representatives in the US. And so a lot of the interest from you people on the talk today began here because Jean worked with the Shriners to get her irises out. And Shriners just loved what she was doing and celebrated it and shared it. So there was that lovely synergy. Okay, whiz bang around the traps of Jean's story. So what next? There's an awful lot more coming. And like I said, I don't even know what some of that is going to look like until I get there. So of the key points at this stage, we're having an official opening of the Jean Stevens Iris Garden in October. And that will be part of the local vintage weekend, which is really cool. So we'll have a bit of a celebration about Jean. Continuing to write my book, and part of that I'm looking more at the leucadendron side. So I'm visiting a man near Melbourne, and I'm visiting a lady near Sydney to understand leucadendrons, understand what Jean and Ian achieved, and to better tell that part of the story. Always collecting more Jean's irises. There's a lovely lady that I've been working with. Well, she's been doing the work. She's connected with me because, as you guys will know, collecting irises is a whole other challenge. Finding irises, figuring out what you're looking at, and all of that work. Looking for more irises. There are other people that I need to go and see. There are more irises of Jean's out there, I'm sure. We just need to go through down the path of finding them. There's a whole nother thing. And one of the loveliest outcomes is actually, this is the beginning for the Basin of building a collection of stories about local botanical heroes. So there's the science, educational side with local schools, but there's also celebrating Jean as a local horticultural hero, and then adding to that with others, because Whanganui has an incredible number of horticultural people back through the generations, but we have almost forgotten those stories. So this is exciting, not just for Jean, but also because it's the beginning of something bigger, which has almost been lost. The photographs here, those spurias, this photo top left was part of Jean and Wally's garden I found relatively recently, and these have kind of gone wild in the paddock, and a lady let me know, and I went up and I've collected some of these. So, and the Morea at the bottom here, there are various kinds of Moreas, so I'm just showing those. As we were talking before, irises is a whole lot more than just bearded irises, even within the Jean story, as you'll be aware of some of this, but the Moreas, we're hoping to get up at the basin to broaden the story in that space as well. And then I've got a couple of things to put back to you guys. So I've had this kind of niggle in the back of my head. Jean is said to have developed and registered 391 iris varieties, but I haven't come across that number when I look at names and lists and things. I'm not sure what I'm missing, or if the number, I don't know where the numbers have come from, but yeah, throw that back if someone's got a bit of a sense of how that might have evolved, or what the reality of all of that is. That would be really useful. And the other side of it is, although the commercial side of Jean's gardens were sold and then the plants were removed, I discovered that there were rhizomes around the house garden when we were collecting plants with the museum herbarium people and so on. And I've collected them all up as best I could and grown them on at my place. Slowly they are flowering for me, and these are three of the, they're just gorgeous flowers. The yellow one on the right is very tall. I'm not an iris expert. I have no idea what they are. I don't even know if they're Jean's or not. I don't know if they were put in after Jean died by my uncle and aunt. I don't know on them, might be even. Yeah, if anyone can help with figuring out what they are, I would love to hear from you. So that's me in a nutshell. That's the story in a nutshell. A quick whiz bang. This photograph here is Jean and Wally and Jocelyn. I think it's when she got engaged to Ian. This is at their property on Mountview Road. And this is not the most recent photograph, but this is the last time I went up to the garden. It's been sold and it's going to have houses. Everything's being lost, apart from what we've managed to save from it. So there's mixed emotions about the whole story, but there's a lot of good coming out of it, and maybe we have to get to the point where we lose something before we realize what we've got and can celebrate and save the rest. So yeah, that's me. I will end my slides, and I hope that's been interesting for you all, and very happy to have a chat.